Previously on agentpalmer.com, a recommendation about Amazon Prime's docuseries This Is Football, which is about soccer, and a book review that I'll get to in a minute. This is the Palmer Files episode 1 with guest Bill Sweeney, where we talk about The Dip by Seth Godin, decision making, and things get meta. Let's do the show. Hello there and welcome. This is The Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Thursik, also known on the internet as Agent Palmer, and this is my podcast. Before I get into our first guest and topic, if you are familiar with my voice, you've probably been waiting for this podcast to happen for a while now, and if you don't recognize my voice, let me explain. For the last 8 years, I've been primarily a blogger, and I write about anything from book and movie reviews, sports, and other topics of interest. In that time, I developed an online persona, Agent Palmer, that evolved into me being a constant podcast guest and producer to earn a moniker from this week's guest, Bill Sweeney, and my circle of friends as a proxy caster, because I didn't need my own show, I had theirs, or yours as the line really is. I finally started this podcast because I enjoyed creating my voice on the blog, and now it's time to take that voice from the digital page to the audio form. I hope to inspire, educate, and entertain you with people I respect and admire, and I hope our conversations are as enlightening to you as they are to me. So, enough about me. The first guest is, as mentioned, Bill Sweeney of the Wicked Theory podcast, and we discuss The Dip. Things get meta because it's a book about decision-making by Seth Godin that I was reading while deciding whether or not to even do this show, which we will get into. Why Bill Sweeney? He's a good friend and a great guest. We first met digitally on Twitter when we were some of the early guests on a show that unfortunately no longer exists called The Stranger Conversations with host Grant Markham. Since then, he's brought his podcast to my house. We took a road trip together to Michigan, and we become friends and creative minds that, wonder of wonders, like to talk about the creative process as much as we enjoy completing the endeavors themselves, which is why he was a no-brainer to discuss this book. If you wish to tweet along, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer, the show at The Palmer Files, and Bill at Wicked Theory. Feel free to email the show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com if you prefer, and don't forget to visit agentpalmer.com and wickedtheory.com for more on myself and Bill and the things that we actually did accomplish. Without further ado, here we go. Bill, why did you recommend this book to me?
It was a little while ago. But if I remember correctly, we were having a conversation, I think, about, I don't know if it was a specific project or it was just like projects in general and like why we finish them, we start them or don't, or about being able to have like perspective towards them, I guess. I'm not really 100%. I think you remember this a little better than I do if there was a super specific thing.
Well, I've been talking about this particular podcast for probably a year and a half or 2 years.
Right.
And at some point in the last, I don't know, in the more recently, I was telling you that I was, thinking about this and I still got the blog, but then I listed like 6 or 7 like other either projects I'm working on or potential projects. And you were like, well, hold on there. Like,
right.
And,
right.
And I will tell you, I just made a note of it. And then the first thing that popped into my head when I read this book, and we'll get into like what it's about and stuff, but like the first thing that popped up was, should I really be doing a podcast? Like, I mean, it's like it came up as part of the conversation that got me to the book, but like, then
well, Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's like, wait, should I? Like, is that?
Well, I think that's a natural reaction from reading a book like this, is that it makes you kind of question, the processes and why you do what you do. And, if makes you question your level of what's success and what's kind of like banging your head against the wall, and whether or not these things are worth it sometimes. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid reaction while going through it, because, it's talking about the dip talks about the fact that in the middle of, these projects or jobs or tasks or anything you want to achieve, that there's usually a point where, it seems like it's a failure, but, it's a good chance if you ride it out, you might hit success. So it's about questioning the whole process of that. So to kind of look at, to open his book and go, oh, I have an endeavor coming up. Well, do I question it in total, or is this going to help me at some point when I think I'm about to bust?
Well, and then it also talks about the idea of, well, winners know when to quit, but winners also know when not to start. So,
Right.
I mean,
Yes.
I've said all along, I've maintained through the few people that I've had conversations about this show with, that I'm not giving up the blog. And
Sure.
as I'm reading through this book, it's like winners know what to get rid of. And like, I'm like, no, absolutely. I'm going to keep doing this one thing and throw this other thing on top of it. And, he talks about, one of the quotes from the book is, you really can't try to do everything, especially if you intend to be the best in the world. And then he goes on to talk about best being subjective, and that's fine. But I'm basically attempting to do everything, kind of, sort of, in doing two really huge things at the same time. So maybe what we've learned is I shouldn't do this.
Well, so it's funny that because it forces you to kind of get real in a sense, or thinking about it in abstracts sometimes, that we both come away with different kind of lessons we pull away from this book that are not necessarily the lessons that the book is trying to lay out. It's like, because very much I was like looking forward to having this talk about the book, because on a second reading of it, it was like, now I kind of started to see the patterns in me in other ways. So while the dip talks about like getting out while it's getting as good, and sometimes like not starting, the not starting thing, though, I feel like has been my real problem. Like, sure, like my instinct a lot of times is to kind of pull out while the project is ramping, kind of thing. But I don't feel that as much anymore once the wheels get going. That anxiety of like, maybe I should just abandon this. Maybe I should just pull out. This was crazy. This was stupid to start this. Like, used to get that a little more often, but not as much. But the thing of like just don't even bother. Don't get started. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's a huge task. That seems, Herculean. You're not going to pull that off. You know what I mean? Like, he's got a thing that, the opposite, because the book talks about how like quitting can be a good thing, and to just kind of take that as it's fine and it's fair. You don't lose. And like, I've never had a problem with quitting. Like, you know what I mean? To quitting a project or quitting before it gets started, that's a tremendous release of pressure for me. The challenge for me is the whole staying with it and kind of taking it on head first. So when he's got a thing in there that's like the opposite of quitting isn't waiting around. That the opposite of quitting is rededication. And that's the thing that I'm not good at. Like he says, the opposite of quitting is an invigorated new strategy designed to break the problem apart. And that's the thing that I don't do a lot of times. I'll just kind of get beat up by like, oh, this isn't working, or this isn't what I thought it would be. And I look for the exit instead of maybe saying more often, well, double down a little bit and get your head straight on it, recommit, and then see where that takes you, and then maybe quit. but I just kind of, you know what I mean? And so it's just twofer of just kind of like quitting without ever rededicating or just not getting started at all, you know?
Well, and he also says like, it's easy to wring your hands about becoming a failure. Quitting smart is a great way to avoid failure because you're not starting something you're going to fail at. But I think there's a lot of unknowns. And he talks about motivation, and he talks about process, and he goes through the idea that, you know, at the very beginning of any project, it's really exciting. And then, you know, it's whether it's learning something new and like, you know, then all of a sudden you go from like easy and beginner to like moderate, and then it gets a little bit harder. And then when you master moderate, it gets really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Well, some people quit there. And I understand the idea of, well, if you can't get through to the hard stuff to get to the success or the end, why bother starting to begin with? And it did make it like, shit, like, do I start this show? Like, it really became, because I mean, I read it while I was preparing to do this. Yes. And it became like, well,
we're in a very meta moment right now with you where it's like, okay, the first episode, I'm going to be talking about the idea of this book. And not only that, but the book has made me question at a certain point whether or not to do the show itself. It's a snake eating its own tail.
It really is. I mean? And but I did it because I feel like it was in him saying that best is subjective. I can do the best podcast I can do and still maintain the best blog that I can do. And I feel like those two things are within my control. And but it's hard because then I made the decision to do this recording tonight. Obviously, I'm doing this and I'm keeping my blog, as people will know. But then I started thinking about the other ancillary projects. I'm helping so-and-so with this. I'm helping so-and-so with that. And it's like, all right, well, clearly something has to give. I'm doing all these things. And so what is the thing that gives? And to be fair, I actually haven't made that decision yet. But because of this book, I'm aware something has to give. Like, I've at least gotten there.
Yeah, because he talks about that a lot too, how, like, you know, part of that rededication in a way is about saying, well, what is all this, what else am I doing in other ways, in projects or whatever, that could be pulling my attention and my time away, that's keeping me from achieving this, you know, this time that I need to spend on this thing, or this, you know, this dedication, this, you know, this energy, you know, upkeep. And so for a guy like you, who actually, you know, like you said, does do a fair amount of helping others in certain fields and has multiple things kind of brewing at all times that are interdependent on other people or their favors, or you know, you're helping or something, there's a certain amount of like, you have to follow through. So I know this is like one of these sessions where it's like, okay, I'm going to talk about me for a little bit and you're going to talk about you for a little bit because that's what's happening right now. But immediately, like, listening to you talk about you makes me think about me and on me, on my side, like, because most of my projects are internal and there's no real hard goal like he talks about in this book, like, it's like, you know, it's not so much like, oh, be the best, but you want to do the best that you can do. You want to kind of like achieve it. You want to finish it. You want to be able to have a thing done at the end that you can kind of be personally proud of, even if it doesn't achieve, you know, media greatness or something. You know what I mean? But for me, because, like, I think anyway, a lot of my stuff doesn't depend on anybody else. There's no deadline. There's no pressure. I don't have a trained follow through in a way where it's like, all right, I don't have to, there's nothing hanging over my head to push me along in a way, like, you know.
But it does work both ways. I feel like in your scenario, it's easier to quit. Not that you will, but it's easier to quit because there's nothing around you. So it's like, all right, well, that's not going anywhere. I'm just not going to do that anymore. Whereas for me, it's harder to quit. It's not saying that in either scenario we should or shouldn't quit. That's up for, you know, you have to look at it and make a decision. But I'm kind of tied to not quitting more often because it's like, oh, well, that person's counting on me and this person's counting on me and that person's counting on me. And it's almost weird because, like, you and I are at two completely different places, but I wouldn't trade with you because it doesn't make it any easier. Like the only
Oh,
way it
no.
could be easy is if like you and I both had 50% of our projects were counting on other people and 50% weren't. And then I'd be like, all right, cool. Like I know how I can handle this.
Right. And I'll tell you from being on the side that I'm on, it's miserable. Like, because here's the thing, like, at least, like, even if you're only getting like half of these little projects done, let's say, right, for you on your scale and all that, that you've got those done. And you know what I mean? Whereas for me, it's a lot of like, oh, there's another thing I never finished. There's another thing I never finished. There's another thing I never finished. There's another thing I never followed through. And this sometimes will go, because I'm a creative, we'll go back to what people can pick up from another book called The War of Art. And that talks about resistance and, you know, why we say no, why we hold back, why we don't finish things, and the different forms it can take. You know what I mean? Making excuses or fear of success or whatever it could be, because those are very different things, but they all kind of go under an umbrella of resistance, and it's an invisible thing that sometimes will keep you from finishing things.
Well, but it's also hard on the other side because it's like, well, that's not done, but I did my part. And I mean, because that's where it's a hard thing where it's like, okay, I did my part, but the project's not done, and I have no control over the rest of it. But like, if it was never going to get done, why would I have? Like, why did my part matter? Yeah,
right. So why did I invest anything in that? Yeah,
and I've been a part of. I've been a part of podcasts that are no longer around.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have remorse or regret over like, oh, I shouldn't have put all this time into that show. And I'm not picking on anybody, by the way. It's just things happen, and I understand it. But, and it's the one thing that's kind of missing from Godin's book. Mm-hmm. He doesn't talk about failure as a learning experience.
Yeah.
It's the one thing in the whole book that seems to be missing. He's got it where I'm completely on board with, if you don't think you can handle the hard stuff, maybe not starting at all is the smart play. But he doesn't talk about what you learn from false starts. And I don't really want to make like this too meta, although I knew this was going to be meta. Like the things I've learned from the podcasts that I helped start that didn't happen and that I jumped on board and was behind the scenes with, whether I'm a part of them or not, and whatever you consider a failure or a flop or just a moving on and a parting of ways, all of that led me to here. So I've learned from all of those things, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing, whatever that is.
Right.
And it's the only thing that's missing. Now, he does say towards the end something about like, if it's scary, maybe it's worth looking into.
Right. Yes.
But that statement seemed like almost counterintuitive to the whole book, which is like, well, if you're not going to go through with it, don't do it.
Right. Well, that's the little bit of the nugget of the book, is that the mantra of the book in a lot of ways is like, don't do it if you don't think you can do it, and only do it if you think you can be top dog. But along the way, be sharp enough to know if it ain't going to work out and get out while the getting's good. So it's a little bit of this kind of like, okay, they feel almost contradictory thoughts, but they are, I don't think that's the case necessarily, but they are kind of like so independent of each other, where it's like you got to kind of swim in that headspace all the time. You know what I mean?
He makes it feel like a video game almost, where like he makes it feel like a video game that doesn't have built-in save points. You have to manually save, okay? Because if the project you've got has built-in save points, then you just reach that next point and then decide whether to go on again. What Godin is saying is you need to manually choose when the save point is and then decide whether to continue. It's on you, not the project. Like, I mean, listen.
Well, yeah, the book is about trying to show you how to spot this stuff in the distance as it's approaching, and then hopefully, you can get out with it getting good, because there's even parts of the book where like some of the examples he uses is about like shifting up like a career, even just a basic career. Like if you're not feeling like you're getting any growth, you know what I mean? Because a lot of it is the book is laid out in these examples and these kind of metaphoric, examples. And so like, Dave's got a job. It's not that great, blah, 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 and so he's talking in a career context where that's just in one moment, you know what I mean? And then it's about taking the idea of the dip and putting it on any situation in a way. But those situations in and of themselves seem very different. Like, you know what I mean? So it's like, I'm trying to read this book and take some of these metaphors and put them into how does this apply to me and what I do? And how does this apply to my podcast experience per se? Because it was a thing where like, I had to take a look at what I was doing with my show and kind of like get real about it a little bit and say like, well, I'm enjoying the hang, but like, we're not getting any new ears, we're zero growth, you know what I mean? And I'm only doing it for fun, but the growth, even on a small level, like should be part of it. Like, and I really felt like that's part of it. Even if it's at a snail's pace, anything that's ticking up would have been a good sign. Like, you know what I mean? And even though like doing the best I could with what I had, it didn't feel like that was getting it anywhere. And so when the writing kind of was starting to be on the wall for the show itself, behind the scenes, and and as trying to get people together on a schedule and stuff like that, it was just like, well, maybe, this is the moment. If it's gonna go off the rail, let's just let it go off the rail, because that was me being real about the moment. I was in the dip, for lack of a better term, and it was like kind of saying, well, what is this moment here? This is either like a point where I can take the break and make a shift, much like the career kind of thing he was talking about in the book, where the guy Dave kind of comes into the boss and he's like, look, I'm ready to walk away, but before I do, I'd like to take one big swing at this idea I had, and maybe you guys will be into it. And so like the guy pitches it, the company's like, oh, we love it. We'll actually give you a raise and put you in charge of that. Like, you know what I mean? And this kind of thing. So it works out for him. So the ideally is like, with my podcast is to kind of like say, okay, let's take it off the burner. Let's kind of like taste the soup. How's it shaping up? What do I got to add?
The way this breaks down for anybody not familiar with the Wicked Theory podcast, and if I go too far, Bill, by all means,
I'll shut you right down.
Is that from about episode 165 or even maybe 150, not counting 150 itself, because that was an anniversary episode of sorts. From about 151 through 199, it was stagnating. There was a formula, and it was just happening. Like we were filling in the formula, and occasionally there would be one or two things that popped up, but they were never new. It was like, oh, we've got a movie review, which had popped up prior in other times. So to be fair, it was a bombshell to me during the roast, when you were like, at the end of it, when you were like, okay, so we're not going to be back next week. And I was like, well, okay. Like and completely behind the scenes, I had actually been pushing you before the roast for like, Bill, God. take a break, take a step back, like 4 weeks, like just take a month off, whatever. And I get this from reading the book, but knowing you and also just general, and podcasting, just like blogging or anything else, once you stop something and you lose that momentum, that momentum is very important to hold on to. Right. And so I know for you, it wasn't the stopping that was the hard part, or even the decision to stop. It was getting back going again. It was the rededication that you were talking about earlier that was like the hardest part. Because, I'll say we, because I was part of the show. It's not like we weren't dedicated to it before. So if you take a break, what does rededication mean because it's you're not applying something new. You need
Right.
to come at it from a completely different angle. And so who's to say where it goes from here? You know, and that's
Right.
one of the hard parts is you don't know. Or
Right. Well, here's the thing.
You're not supposed to.
And the lesson that I know I'm walking, that I've kind of learned it and realize and know that I'm walking into is that is a problematic area because, you know, there's still no plan. I mean, if we're going to be honest about it, all I knew was that it kind of had to put the brakes on it and reconsider what's going on and what I'm doing and what I want to do. And the problem is that those answers still haven't come in a crystal clear way where it's like, okay, I'm going to, like, some people are lucky enough to have more clarity on this thing. So it's like, okay, you know, it's in somebody else's hands. Maybe it's, you know, I'm going to stop the show, take a break, 2 weeks, come back, new show, new format, and everything like is kind of like well considered and prepped for. And as much as I spend time thinking on these things, you know, this is the fact that podcast came out every week for 200 episodes, almost on time every freaking time, is an achievement in and of itself for me that, like, I look back on and go, wow, because of my propensity to kind of like slack off or kind of like, oh, that's, you know, let something become a bigger problem because then like subconsciously it's like, all right, that's going to give me breathing room. I don't have to worry about it this week. So when we hit 200, the one thing I knew in the back of my head is two things, but that I don't know what the plan is going forward necessarily. I mean, I have some ideas, but nothing's locked, like, you know, and like, oh, that's it, you know, and B, that like, I knew that if it was more than a couple of weeks, it was going to be like this bumpy return, which is what it's turned into. If I'm being honest about myself and the show and trying to maintain a rhythm with it, I knew if I didn't stay on a schedule, if I didn't just kind of turn around and come back and like do some crazy thing where it's like, oh, it's just me and I'm ranting into the mic, then it was going to get off kilter, which is where it's at right now.
So I will give, I've got 2 points to that. First, I understand the idea of the 200 episodes being a milestone in itself personally. I spent 1 semester abroad in high school and journaled every day of that 3 months, 4 months, 3 months, whatever it was, right? Every day. Now, this is me as like a 15, 16-year-old, whatever. I had started and attempted a journal / diary, whatever you want to call it, before. And I'd never made it past couple days, like never in my life. Now I understand this is a special circumstance. I'm in another country, you know, but there's nothing to say that there was anything more different about me writing then than anything else. And I look back and go, until I started my blog, that had been the most regular writing I had ever done, period, and consistently. Now I've got a blog, and even if you look at the dates, when you go back to like the very early stuff, I was not consistent at all. It's only been in the last 2 or 3 years that I've been consistent, but that consistency is huge internally. So I understand. And then it goes back to the momentum thing. But I also feel like part of your rededication is to literally use your existing feed as a petri dish and try an episode like this and try an episode like that and see what works and what reactions you get. Because if you weren't rededicated to it, because I'll use his language, you would either have completely folded up or you would have just gone back to doing the same old thing. You're trying new things in a way to find out what will work and become the best at what you can be. I also wanted to talk about the fact that you and I personally, unrelated to my blog, your show, or any projects else, you and I love to talk about process.
Right.
And this book, I couldn't have expected anyone else to ever like suggest I read this book. Like, it
Okay.
just feels like, oh, of course.
Sure.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm only a couple pages in. I'm like, of course, this is the one, Bill. But
yeah.
process is important to some people. Other people don't care. It's like, oh, great, I've got this book. Other people care about, like, did you outline it? How many drafts were there? Like, how many? But it depends. And for the people that pay attention to process,
Mm-hmm.
their own process is the most important part. So
Right.
for you and me, it is like our process is special. It's not necessarily about the end product. It's also about how we got there.
Well, that's the thing. It's about there is a love of the game. You know what I mean? It's
right.
like, well, when it's a thing about enjoy being so into process that when you're involved in an actual process that you're like there's books about process, and then this is about thinking about process. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is almost like esoteric, this kind of a concept, the dip, in comparison to something that's more mechanical, like you were mentioning. Like, it's like, okay, here's how you do an outline and stuff. And this is almost like this is like, even though it's a small book, it's like a bigger idea. It's a broader picture. It's like thinking outside the box. Like, it's about why we do what we do, as opposed to like how to do what you want to do. Which is why this kind of a approach and idea of the dip kind of applies to multiple things, and like the examples he can give are so vast and wide. But
and it works out that I'm convinced that if you read this book, one of his examples will speak directly to you at minimum. I mean, he covers so many different scenarios, from personal projects to work projects, and like everything you could like hobbies even, and like learning a language.
Relationships. This graph, this chart, this symbol of the dip itself, when he shows it as a line and how it works, is a relationship. This is the beginning, when it's all good and gravy, and then it gets really pretty freaking cool, you know what I mean? And then it does this kind of point, and this can be anywhere. This can be like round about a year, 2 years, 2 months, but whatever. You kind of hit this low point where it's like, what is this? And then if you slog through, ideally, it should kind of pick up again and then be great. And then you get married and you just love each other every day forever. It's amazing all the time.
In contemporary culture, that little bit before the dip, which this book is focused on, is the honeymoon period. And that's when you're talking colloquially with relationships, that's what we're talking about, the honeymoon period. And when the honeymoon period's over,
post honeymoon, but go ahead.
Well, the dip happens post honeymoon. It happens when the honeymoon's over, but that doesn't mean there aren't sunny days ahead, so to speak. And
the dip is the long slog between starting and mastery. That's basically that's the line right here that I have highlighted, and that's the thing that's applicable to anything. The dip is like when you start learning how to play baseball, and then the mastery comes later. But the dip itself is that point right where you want to give up and quit. You know what I mean? Where you're just like, why am I fighting?
And that long process in between is what creates scarcity. And as he discusses in the book at length, one of the other things he talked about is scarcity makes being at the top worth something. If everybody can get to the top, then it's a level playing field. Like, nobody wants to be the best of being everyone else, because then you're just the same as everyone else. And so the dip is the line of demarcation.
Here's the thing, like he's got a point here, right? The difference between a mediocre tennis player and a regional champion isn't always the talent. It's the ability to push through the moments where it's just easier to quit. And I think that's the thing for me that is the ultimate takeaway. And with a book like this, I think it's a thing where, it's about keeping your eyes out for it. And the hard and fast lessons that are even numbered at near the end, like, there's only a few of them of how to spot the dip, how to, because the book is not about necessarily like preventing it, or like, the 7 secrets of breaking out of it. Like it's how other books like, how to break out a writer's block. Like, you know what I mean? These kinds of like real hard tips that are applicable or supposed to be anyway, very easily and broadly. This is, you know, a little bit of generalities, and you have to find how these things apply to you.
There's a very subtle philosophical piece to this book, which is about value and progress, because value and progress are not concrete. They mean different things to different people. And it's the very reason that so much of this book is abstract, and he uses examples and hyperbole, because there's no way he can A, talk about your specific scenario, and B, there's no right answer. As an example, Bill and I could be in the same exact spot with the same exact progress, value, and everything else. But because we're different people, I'm going to quit and Bill's going to keep going, because base of our our read of the situation determines what that is. And
sure,
if you're looking for like self-help, this is not the book for you. This is not, 12 ways to clean your house.
No, because this is definitely a book where it's like, it's going to be a little bit like, hey, look, you came here for a little bit of a wake-up call, and it's trying to be like, tell you that you have to be kind of dead ass in a sense. You have to be real honest about if it's time, it's one of the marked off things I got. Quit the wrong stuff, stick with the right stuff, have the guts to do one or the other, and I feel like that speaks to me in a lot of ways, because I always feel like I'm in a situation of, it's like shit or get off the pot, like really commit or just be comfortable where you're at then, because even he says that in the book. It's like, it's all right to be mediocre if you're okay with that mediocre status. But if you're not, then here we are. Like, you know what I mean? So like for me with the podcast, like the only person who, like in the end, looking back, the only person who held it back would be me, because people sometimes would be like, oh, maybe we should do this or do that. And I always had a reason to not, always found some kind of like, man, I don't know. Doesn't feel like, like whatever, stage shy, gun shy, didn't want to pull the trigger, whatever, but always found something,
I'll bet you're wishing you had a list of all those ideas you said no to. Because in the rededication, you could be like, well, I've got this list of, and listen, I speak from experience. I can't tell the audience, the listenership right now, how many ideas I was like, hey, Bill, how about, nah.
Yeah. Between you and the guys on the show, like people would throw stuff at me. And what I've learned is that, like, first of all, outside of you, because you still pitch me shit all the time. Anytime you've got an idea that applies to me, you'll call me up and be like, hey, what do you think about this? And then you'll just bounce it off me, because it's like, it may not stick, but I'm not going to chase it hard either, because Bill might just shoot it down, but I'm going to at least lob the ball over the net and see if he dings it back over maybe. But yeah, so like other people would get, I think, probably tired of suggesting things after a while, though. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that was the case with anybody in particular, but I do know that it's very much, I'm always reminded of a thing a friend said to me, like, well, look, like we call you to hang out, and if you say no all the time, then people are going to stop calling to see if you want to hang out and do anything. And then it's going to be a thing where like, oh, no one calls me to hang out. So don't like, you know what I mean? So it's a little bit of a lesson of a thing where it's like, oh, well, if I shoot down ideas from people, maybe the ideas stop coming.
I mean, I get that, but at the same time, I look at it like a wall. And listen, let's say there's a wall you need to break down, and all you have is a hammer. Guess what? The first 1,000 million whacks at that wall, you're not going to get a hole through it. Like, you're just not. You have to keep going. It's almost a complete metaphor for the dip itself. Like, you just have to get through.
You need persistence.
You need that. Now, there is also banging your head against the wall. If it's like a play school hammer, you're not going to get anywhere. Like, you need to actually
I was going to adjust your metaphor there and say, well, when dealing with me, it's not a hammer. It's more like trying to take the wall down with like a Q-tip, or something like soft that's
But
not going to get the job done.
But you need to know what you're doing. And we'll talk about it now, but who the hell knows what happens is you have said yes to some ideas. Now, I will be honest, Bill has read this book once before. He's now reread it. And Bill pitches me some ideas occasionally. It's not a complete one-way street. But the other thing is, we don't always necessarily apply the concepts of the dip, should I do it or shouldn't I, immediately to an idea.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of try and build it first. I mean, and it's one of the things about like, hey, Bill, you should totally do this on your show. Okay, how would I do that? And then we talk about it. And it's not until it's a full idea. Like, because the other part about this, there is no such thing as too much knowledge. There is no such thing as too much information. If you know what's going on, you can make a better decision as to whether you should continue or not. That's just the way it works. The less facts you have, the less the less you've got to go on.
Right.
If I know I got to drive east to get to your house, it's not as good as having a map.
Sure. I mean, you'll get there, but it'll take you a while.
And at that point, maybe it's better not to.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing. It's these internal questions, and it's about, having enough information in your own space to know and bouncing it off people and knowing that even if, all right, this is a thing, because that's at least the thing that I am realistic about is like, okay, even if you come to me with an idea that off the bat is like something I would never do, or that's kind of crazy, why are you coming to me with this? I'll still bounce it around and take it apart and try and see if it doesn't work for me in whole, what is appealing to me in that idea? Where does that send my head? Like, let me bounce it around a little bit to give it a fair shakedown, because I'm not going to dismiss it outright. But again, like, it just does bring me back to the thing that I know that I have a propensity to, like, my greater weakness or greater crutch in a way is to find the soft out, before it gets even started, because when I see the big challenge, I either get intimidated by it somehow on some level, or the level of the work and commitment involved seems greater than I want to put in for that particular thing. And I don't often see a thing that feels like 100%, oh, I can do that. And I think I can, like, outside of like just kind of putting together a podcast, because I knew it would be easy and I figured I knew enough nerd shit and I knew how to talk and be relatively amusing, that if I found some people, I could make a go of that. But that's a rare thing for me to see something and be like, oh, I can see that all the way through to the other side in my imagination. I know I can ride that out easily.
See, and on the other side, I look for the hard out, because my default for the longest time was yes. So
Right.
like, I'm not looking for the easy out. I'm looking for the hard out. Like,
right.
And it's odd that we come at it from two completely different instances, because you mentioned earlier, for the love of the game. It doesn't matter if we win or we lose. We enjoy playing the game. And when we're working on a creative project specifically,
right,
you and I are both in our element within that creative space. And that's part of the fun for us. And it's so odd that, like, you look for a way to say no right from the beginning, and I look for a way not to say yes. Like, I mean, because that's basically what I'm looking for. It's like, all right, Bill came to me with a new idea. All right, I want to do it, but like, where's the no? Because otherwise, like, the default is yes. Now, I have changed. Like, I have gotten in the short few years that you and I have been working together, I have actually turned around on that. And maybe it's because I realized, like, my time's not indefinite, and
Mhm.
it's not even the dip. It's just being realistic. Okay, I can help Bill and do my own thing, but yeah, no, I'm not going to have time for your thing over there, Bob. Sorry. Like it's realistic, but that in reading the dip, what you learn is, all right, but I could be giving Bill's show and my own stuff even
Mhm.
more time if I get rid of some of these other ancillary projects.
Yeah.
But you really have to be, it's self-realization. Like you
Mhm.
definitely have to take a look. You have to be able to look at yourself in a mirror in
Yeah.
in an honest way. Like this book is, you defeat the purpose of reading this book if you look in the mirror and go, all right, here's the 15 things I'm working on. I
Mhm.
can do all of them.
Right.
Somewhere along the way, you're lying to yourself.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying people can't do 15 different things.
No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot to be said for. There's a limit to multitasking. The brain can only balance so much, and your after a while, your dedication, starts to run thin on multiple things. There's only so much juggling you can do, and there's only so much juggling you should be doing. Like you should only give of yourself so much anyway, because it's probably not, like, in a general sense, the greatest thing to kind of, like, you know bury yourself too much into the helping of others, to the fact that, like, oh, now my stuff's getting all out of whack because I'm doing 5 6 different things this week that I'm doing, to help people. I'm doing, not to say, oh, free is a bad thing. I'm just saying, like, it's not like it's quote unquote work. You know what I mean?
No,
It's like, I'm helping this guy with this thing, I'm helping this guy with that thing, you know.
and I go back to a shared project you and I worked on. We worked on the first and second Podtoberfest for 7 Days a Geek.
Hmm.
And I know in preparation for that, I did double work on my own projects, like doing extra work before you go away for vacation,
Oh,
because
right,
you
right.
know while you're on vacation you won't be doing work, but you don't want to come
Sure.
back behind the eight ball.
Hmm.
And that's at times what it can end up being.
Hmm.
Um, Full disclosure, I'm a workaholic anyway. Like I prefer to just keep doing the work week in and week out and not take the vacation.
Right. Well, that, like I said, like, this is the thing that, like, I always kind of give you kudos for in a lot of ways, because of the fact of how different I am, and I don't fucking overly commit. I don't stay on top of my projects. I don't, see a lot of them through to the other side, even for small personal little creative things. That when I watch you do it, I'm always like, well, here's a guy who fucking just keeps going. Like, he's like, okay, I've got posts lined up in advance that are already done. I got all of next August. I'm like, August is next year. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. And it's like, what? And it's like, this kind of thing. Now, I know that you're not as far ahead as you once were, but you used to be pretty freaking far ahead. And, I used to kind of be in awe of that. I'm like, oh, here's a guy, like, he constantly is churning it out. He's staying on top of it. He's keeping this momentum and this rhythm. Uh, for the sake of his blog, and is still finding time to do stuff that he's really excited to do for friends. And, not that you weren't happy to help others, but, like, even stuff then on the side that's at that lower level where it's like, oh yeah, okay, I'll help you out. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's a difference between, like, Podtoberfest, where it's like, it's a lot of work, but we're excited about it and it's fun. And, like, part of the fun is just working together and having some laughs on the side, versus, like, I got to help my mom. She's getting a new computer, or, like, I got to debug. A friend of mine called me, doesn't know how to fix a thing. Like, you know what I mean? So, like, these ways that you were able to still maintain your rhythm of putting out material, I was always, like, a little, I don't know if jealous is the right word, but always like, well, I used to say to myself, well, look at this guy. This guy's fucking pumping it out. This guy's getting it done. And not to blow smoke up your ass anyway, because it's not like, oh, this monumental achievement, like in a broad sense, but to me, because I just can't stick on stuff. Like, you know what I mean? Because even if I do, because here's the thing, right? My weakness is not getting a thing started, because it's easier to cop out. And then B, when I start, I kind of lose my interest or luster for it. So it's easy to kind of, like, just kind of drift away from it. And it's like, well, it was only a story idea anyway. But it's like, no, it was a story idea that you kind of felt like you could see a whole novel through. So what are you being a chicken about? Just kind of chip away at it then.
So I will tell you that the appearance is all that it really ends up mattering, right? Like I put out one blog a week. That's what's important. I am a firm believer in strike while the iron's hot. That's how I end up with, I'm completely drafted up for the next 7 posts. Like I'm good. Like that's fine. But what happens is then you get on another project, and what you talk about the fear of losing the momentum for you stopped at 200 and then I can't start again. I've been in a scenario where something happened in my professional life. I lost my job. When I lost my job, I was 6 weeks ahead on the blog. But because of like, I got to find another job, all this other stuff, the unknowns, the sheer like mental, it's not a collapse, but like the hurdles you have to go through.
Internal pressure. Yeah.
I ended up, the next time I ended up writing, I had 1 week to spare. I used up 5 of my 6 weeks. And
what's funny is that it's in a time frame where you weren't really working a day job, so you probably could have actually gotten more head time. You know what I mean? But the mental state just isn't working like that. It's like I'm in panic mode. Everything's out the window. Real life is more important than a blog.
Now, I may have seen this coming, but I didn't know exactly when it was going to happen. So there are scenarios where it's like, whatever. But I will tell you, getting back in it and doing it again, it's just as hard. So while on the outside, I haven't missed a week.
Right.
The blog has continued. I had this golden few weeks where it's like, I was writing like 4 posts in a week, and then like 5 weeks of nothing, and then I'm up against it again. Like, what am I gonna do? I got 3 days till the blog. Like, so like, there's all these things, as far as like that was just in terms of the blog, and I still was helping with podcasts, and I was still doing all this stuff, and I guess I feel like I wasn't trying to outdo anyone or like make you feel like or whatever. Like it wasn't about ego. It wasn't about like, hey, Bill, you do 1 show a week. I do one blog post a week. But how come you're not doing 2 other podcasts like I'm doing? And that, like, it's not about that for me. I enjoy the process, and that's where we get bogged into it. And it's like, all right. And the other thing, and I wanted to say this, and this is just me being in love with the process, and maybe too much so, is that you don't have to remember your projects. I do that for you. Like that was, and I don't know if it was like a big joke, and I don't know if it ever became like a thing where like you were like, what? Like I'm not trying to, blow smoke up my own ass, but it was like, I wonder what Bill's gonna do if I go away. Like, and I've told you before, like whatever your next big show is, I'm completely on board if I can help. But like for a while there, it was like, hey Bill, you gotta do this. Hey Bill, did you do the thing? Like, and you're not the only one I've done that for. I guess I'm just slightly, and I'm not picking on anyone. I'm just slightly a little more organized, which doesn't make me an organized person.
No, but I mean, look, anybody who's organized at all is more organized than I am at all. You know what I mean? If you're just a little bit, you know what I mean? Like, you put your clothes away when they come back from the laundry. Oh, that's interesting. It's like, that's a concept I'm not familiar with. There was a point where like I do that too, where it was like, he's helping me so much behind the scenes, putting the small stuff together that it's like, and I would realize it too every now and then when you weren't around to help out for a week or so, and it'd be like, oh crap, man, this guy is doing some heavy lifting, and not heavy, but like the stuff, and it was all the stuff I didn't want to do, all the stuff like I hated doing, you know what I mean? So it was like, at least he's around, and it was good that you took those breaks, because otherwise I would have been way too comfortable.
I was gonna say I know specifically and I don't know how it started, but at a certain point for your show, I started writing the show
Episodes.
notes live,
Yes.
like
Mhm.
during
Yeah.
the show. So like when you brought it down at 10 o'clock, you could
Mhm.
literally go in there and the show notes would be there. And
Right.
I remember, like, I think I did this for like 7 or 8 weeks, and then like something came up and I missed a show.
Mhm.
And you were like, I don't know how to write these anymore. Like it was just like muscle memory was gone for you. You were like,
yeah, like
how
what
do I
did
write
used
these?
to do? How did I do it before he came along? Like, sure, like it's not going to be as detailed, and then eventually, like you would have this long thing, and you'd have all these kind of like great little moments and stuff written out, and then when I had to do it, it'd be like, yeah, we talked about 5 things and we were done, and it's like, a paragraph compared to like at least 2 or 3, but that's one of the things that like just goes to show in a way where like my problems are not necessarily solved by this book because I'm a creature of contention. My bigger problems is like I need the book like that happens before this book. Like you know what I mean? Like the dip is a thing like to be aware of when you're in the middle of it, or when you're doing it and it's running. And what I feel like I really need is something that's like, hey, wake up, and here's how you pick a lane. Like, you know what I mean? That's where my need. This is one of the things that this book helped me realize is that I need a different book, in a way, because there's things in this book mentions and does allude to that are just examples offhandedly that are like speak to me much more than the rest of the book. So, like in this example here, he gives this example of when talking about just how to spot these strategies and stuff, and he goes through this thing of the supermarket line of like there's like 3 basic strategies, and it's like literally do I get in a lane and stay in a lane? Do I bounce around from lane to lane? Or do I pick the shortest line, just keep my eyes open? And that's the problem, literally, for me, is not picking a lane. And if anything, I'm the guy who, although I don't do it in real life, but metaphorically, I do it all the time, of this jumping around thing. What do I do? Not commit to any one thing in a big way. Like being a podcaster, quote unquote, is creatively probably the truest thing, but it's the one thing that like in a dream world I would want to be least known for. I'd rather be known for my writing or something like that, something on the creative side, like my art. You know what I mean? But the thing is, like, he's got a great example here. Like, and he uses an entrepreneur wannabe as an example who's like, on a 6th or 12th new project. He jumps from one to another, and every time he hits an obstacle, he switches to a new, easier, better opportunity. And while he's a seeker, he's never going to get anywhere. He never gets anywhere because he's switching lines, never really able to run for it. While starting up is fun and thrilling, it's not enough to get you through the dip that your efforts will pay off. And that's a thing that, like, I tend to do. Like, you know what I mean? And so, whereas, the dip's got a lot of great material in it, and it's really a handy dandy book for, like I said, like being in the middle of these processes, being in the middle of projects, recognizing certain aspects of them while they're running. My real defect might stem from like something when I was a kid and I was allowed to kind of quit when it got hard, and I should have stuck through, which is a concept of the dip. But what I've learned, the thing I fell into the habit of being able to do, though, was learn, I can just kind of back out of things before they even start. And then I've not committed to it. And therefore, no fuss, no muss, no worry, nothing at all. I just got to deal with feeling like, maybe I should have done that. And now that's caught up with me. Feeling like I should have done that. I've hit my 40s. So regrets are starting to kick in.
The interesting thing about this book that it doesn't speak to me is helping you with your show.
Okay.
No.
Well, I just didn't expect you to go right there, right then, in that way.
No, it was just
that sentence.
It was just we were already talking about it. So instead of bringing in somebody else's show, I'll pile on yours. No,
Fair enough.
it doesn't help with I didn't define success for your show. I was helping out.
Right.
And I was happy to do it, but I wasn't defining success.
Mm-hmm.
So in reading this entire book, and I'm using your show as an example, but any show I've ever helped with,
right.
This book didn't help me determine if I should be helping that show or not. It really didn't.
Yeah.
Like I'm helping out, and that's fine. And do I get something out of it? And is it moving? And I guess that's based on it goes back to the education part of like, I was learning things as I was going along. So
okay, that's true.
That's part of it. But it doesn't really, in being part of the process, but not the decision maker.
Yes.
And that's the key, because I feel like this book is specifically for, it's your project, your decision maker.
Yes. But, no, that's what I was going to say. Pretty much, I was trying to jump in, but you ended up on it. Is that the book is not for a guy. Well, it's not for your situations of that, where you're a friend on the edge, an assistant, a producer type who's, not the showrunner per se. Therefore, your juggling act that you're doing internally is a different one. You know what I mean? Your goal is not to worry about the bigger picture of, is this thing a success? You were looking at these small things you're helping with, as in, am I helping? Am I a success in that regard? Kind of like, okay, can I get this done on time? It's a small, easy thing for me from the outside, helping these guys, whether or not that show is working or doing something better, in its numbers or some other aspect. That's really not your concern. But what this could apply to is your personal projects, though, so, but, also too, I feel like for you, this will probably be a thing when you're dealing with your bigger decisions and processes and questions and life questions, career wise, and doing your own podcast, or when you hit some kind of wall with your own blog maybe one day, or start to feel like this is my input versus my returns, that kind of a question. This is a book that's a little bit kind of, it's broader spectrum in that way, you know what I mean? But still at the same time, very defined, where it's like, it's for a specific type of person who's doing some kind of like, you have to be the project leader or concept decision maker. You know what I mean? The guy who's steering the ship, this is for them to do we abandon this ship? Do we jump off with the life preservers, or do we try and ride out these waves and maybe, just like the graph, ride one big crest up, and then we're just good for, a long time. But, some of the concepts in this book too talk about, how these corporations sustain that. And it's like never, always being aware of these kinds of concepts of a dip and stuff like that, are always, you'd be surprised when these things will pop into your head and actually be helpful. Yeah.
I mean, this book isn't telling you to run out and quit everything, and it's not telling you to run out and do everything. It's telling you to take a look and take stock of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And perhaps, and you really do need to take a snapshot of everything. It's not a vacuum of, should I do this podcast or not? Should I continue this blog or not? It's, I have a blog. What happens if I add a podcast? It's, you have to look at both. This is not a book for just that single project. It doesn't work. You have to look at it in terms of everything else, because you can. I mean, there are so many examples of it. If your goal is to write a book, you don't have to quit your day job, which also means you don't have to stop writing your book because you have a day job. These are things you need to look at in a whole. And it's one of those, you have to look at the mirror. You have to look at the whole mirror. You can't just be like, I'm good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the thing too, is like, it's, for me, it's constant. I constantly wrestle with, for all these kinds of things I hear about and learn, why don't I ever just And I go, oh wow, okay, yeah, it's that easy. Like, you know what I mean? Or whatever. How come I can't get it done? Like I said, I need a different book. My thing is my follow through, like on projects in general. It's like I'll sit there and I'll hear about like, oh, this guy, he was a cop. He not a cop, but there's a guy going to work every day, and he wrote a book on his commute. He's like, oh, I got all this time, and on his phone, just kind of thumb typed it through, and eventually over time, it's like they say, a page a day adds up. You know what I mean? Da 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 da. And it's like, well, if it's just that fucking easy, how come I'm not? Why don't I do it? And so I have other questions that I need to get to the bottom of. This particular therapy session probably is not the one,
well,
for me to.
I mean, I guess the question is, was this book helpful to you at all?
Yeah. I mean, and I'm not going to say how much of it was consciously in my head when I kind of like decided to wrap up the show, because that was a thing that like I didn't want to do, but it was so in the air and just was the only way to kind of wrestle anything out of it, was to kind of say, all right, this is a point where I have to either take a break soon or figure it out. 200 is a nice round number, but literally, I've told you this, I wasn't going to do that. That wasn't my plan that day. That Ed said to me, I think I kind of trailed off, and I was like, all right, so I guess, and Ed goes, that's it. This is it. Meaning, I think he meant in the moment, like,
the end of the show.
We're done with the episode.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I was, like you said, done with the show. You know what I mean? Like, I always wrestle with that too. Show, episode, podcast do not mean the same thing. People use them interchangeably. But my point being that, and instinctually, I immediately fell into, I guess this show is done. I guess the podcast is done. And whether it was subconscious or not, because it wasn't my plan going in, and it certainly was barely even my plan as I was saying it. It just kind of fell out of my mouth. That's like, wow, I guess that's my subconscious talking, or just me seeing an opportunity, and was just with like that moment of laser focus saying, I can do it right now. I could just right now would be the perfect moment to do that if I want to do that. And I said, okay.
It was the only moment in the entire night that gave me a pause, because I was so not expecting it. But I will say, this is where persistence pays off, people, because I'd like to think that the 6 to 8 weeks prior of me being like, Bill, you need to take a break. Bill, you need to take a break. Bill, you need to take a break.
What a flip. How, like, on your side, this was an achievement. On my side, it was kind of like, it's a crossroads. I don't know what's going to happen. Whoa. And you were like, I did it. I got through. I finally, my little tiny Fisher Price hammer, I managed to make the crack in the damn wall, and now the water's rushing in. Oh man, hopefully we can all drown. But Seth Godin, I hope you're listening. This man, I don't know if it counts, but he achieved something before he even read the book, right? Because that was before.
That was before. Right? Yeah, I mean, I will say this. This book is very obvious. And sure. I don't mean to say like don't pick it up, but like Seth is not saying anything that A, you haven't already heard, B, you haven't already heard yourself, or C, you're just overlooking it. I mean,
I think the concept of the dip might be new to you, but the explanations and the reasons why are very kind of familiar, and it's nothing earth-shakingly kind of like, oh wow, that's a fucking like, massive, right? Like it all feels very kind of self-obvious, like, oh, I should have considered this, should have thought of that, like stuff like that.
It's the and you know what? I will say you only have to read the book once. Because it's like, and I'm going to give 2 examples to be fair. It's like seeing the arrow in the FedEx logo or seeing the smile of the Amazon logo. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go Google FedEx and Google those Amazon logo. But like once you see it, you can't unsee it. Like I think he kind of knows that there's only so much
reread value maybe, but I think you might be wrong on that, because when I reread it a second time, I was able to kind of like do more different layer of self-inflection.
Well,
But he's got a page in the back, which I think is great.
Yeah.
Which is to share the book, and like you can fill out your name, fill out the names of people who the book should go to, like pass it around, that kind of thing, and everybody can kind of like fill it out. So the idea that don't buy somebody a copy, send them yours, you know what I mean, kind of thing. But I sent you a brand new one.
Yeah, well, but I will say the other side of it is how much has taken place in your life since the last time you read this book. So potentially when you write the 7 or 10 or 9 or 11 names on it of like, these are the people who should put your name down as like the 12th person, because when it comes back to you, you'll be in a different place. You'll be doing different things potentially, you know, I mean, we could all be so lucky as to have the same job for whatever and be doing the same projects and still feel the same way about them.
Right.
But life experience changes.
And, I will say that, it's not, it's very much, you have to put your experience on top of it in a lot of ways. You really have to kind of read it with that kind of a headspace where like he's trying to really kind of put this concept home to you. And it's not a long book by any means. And the concepts are very simple. It's nothing crazy. There's no heavy lifting here, but it is a thing where like, it's a little blunt, it's a little blunt, if you're not trying to be as best as you can be, why are you in it, in a sense, you know what I mean? It depends on what you're trying to achieve. But for a lot of people, it's like, sometimes maybe that's the only real nudge you need, is to kind of like, go, okay, I wasn't aiming, if you weren't aiming to be the best and ended up at much less than that, then that's probably why you ended up there, and you should reconsider that.
Yeah. Well, I aimed for the best, Bill. And I had you on for my first, so
you landed here with me.
That's
I don't know, buddy. Crazy choices you make sometimes, You know
what? I read this book and decided to start a podcast in spite of it. Take that, Seth Godin. Bill, thanks for coming on.
Palmer, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure for me. It's something of a little honor to be the first, but definitely not the last. Or you know what? I want to be your last. Make me your last guest if you ever decide, because of reading the dip, that it's time to abandon the project. But that the end is coming, and then have me help you close the door.
All right, I'll mark it down, but that's not to say the next time Bill's on, if he's on again, is the last time.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah. Let me not be a signifier.
I'll just let people know right now, if I have Bill on for the end of the podcast, it will literally be called Bill Comes On to End the Podcast.
Right. Yes. It will be clearly marked in the title.
There you go.
Have a good one, buddy. Thanks so much.
Thank you. This outro bit is going to be a bit of a work in progress. Not all episodes will have a summarization, but I'm sure I'll have something to say at the end, so let's do it. This one I can summarize. There is no one magical elixir to assist with decision making or to optimize your process. A lot of it is trial and error, but books like The Dip by Seth Godin and discussions like the one you just heard, the likes of which I encourage you to have with others, can be extremely beneficial to you. You can find links to The Dip by Seth Godin, The War of Art that Bill mentioned, and a bunch of other information in the show notes. Now, for some more official business, the Palmer Files will release every 2 weeks on Tuesdays, so during our fortnight apart, I encourage you to join or further the discussion. Let me hear what you think. You can tweet the show at The Palmer Files, myself at Agent Palmer, and this week's guest, Bill Sweeney, at Wicked Theory. Twitter not your thing? Send an email to thepalmerfiles@gmail.com, and don't forget to visit Bill's site, wickedtheory.com, and see what I've got going on in the meantime at agentpalmer.com. You can also hear more of me in the meantime on Our Liner Notes, a musical conversation podcast I co-host with Chris Meyer, and my new gig as co-host of the Podcast Digest with Dan Lizette. Until next time, have a good one. So, Bill, do you have one last question?
It's something for you. Well, we talked a lot about projects, and not that you don't have to get crazy specific, but do you have? Because I know I kind of do. So, do you have like one project that like is like off to the side? Is like that's like I really want to do that. That's the thing that like scares me the most or seems like the most work, but is like one of like the dream kind of project things to get done one day, the Great American Novel or something of that. Like, you know what I mean? Like something that feels like, oh, I'm going to get to that. It's a lot of work. It's a big project, but I'm going to, man, I hope I get to it.
Yes, but it's not my project. I'm a part of it. So this is how it works. I've got a friend named Jason Zapata, and he is a writer and a poet. And I edited his book, which, by the way, it's called Nocturnal Wanderings. You can get it on Amazon. I'll pitch his book real quick.
Sure.
But he wrote a novel from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. And I edited said novel on the first draft, and it's been on the shelf ever since. And I really want to get that thing published. And he wavers on it. And so that's like the big project. Will it ever? It's not, again, and it speaks to a lot of the episode. Like, it's not mine.
Not yours, right.
But I'm also invested in it. And I was, I was a sounding board throughout the creation of the first draft. And I really want to see it to fruition, almost more for him than for me.
Sure. It's earned a little place in you, yeah.
That's the big project. And it's like, and every once in a while, I'll bring it up to him. Like, he's one of my best friends, so I'm like, I don't bring it up all the time. But occasionally I'll be like, and I won't even say what it is just in case. But I'm like,
any movement on that thing?
We going to look at that again? We going to do
yeah. So anytime soon? You going to dust that off?
That's the one.
You hear that, Zapata? Get on it.